Every artist gets asked some variant of the following questions. Who are your influences? What inspired you to become an artist or draw XYZ? How did you develop your art style? Today, I'm going to attempt to try and answer some of these questions. Hi, my name is Kellery Bird, and I am a digital artist and a webcomic creator. I make a historical fantasy webcomic series called Saffron Wave, which is about a Minoan magical girl. This video is the first in what will hopefully be a series of essentially why I draw the way that I do, where my influences and inspirations come from, all that fun, juicy stuff people usually want to know about artists. This is going to be a series mostly just because I have a lot of creators and series and things like that I draw influence and inspiration from. And there's generally a lot that I'd like to get into, either in terms of a creator and or their series, or just like a general category of things that I wasn't really able to break up into either like, okay, it's just this one creator, it's just this one series. So I'm going to be lumping those into categories so that they have their own videos that'll all hopefully be about the same length of time. So in addition to talking about where my inspirations and influences come from, I'd also like to talk about who and why, and if I did that for every single thing that I'd like to put into this little series, it would make the video unbearably long if I tried cramming it all into one video. So I'm going to be doing a series. Really quick, the art in this video is a time-lapse of my main character from my webcomic, Nefeli, in a special edition outfit to celebrate the fact that my comic has now joined the Spider Forest webcomic collective. This has been a goal of mine for quite a while, and I'm so glad that I was able to achieve it. So I made this little announcement and I drew her a special little Spider Forest themed outfit. I also just want to have some content that's relatively easy to put together, and this seemed like a good idea. I ended up getting sick at the end of last month before I went out of town for a few days, so I did not have time or energy to make a video last month, so that's why this got pushed to September. I'm going to be incredibly busy until probably the end of November, so I'm not going to have as much time to put towards making and editing videos. So having something like this where it's just me talking over some art recordings in the background seemed like a good middle ground for all of that. So with this first video, I'd like to talk about perhaps my biggest influence and honestly the reason why I even became an artist in the first place. The one single thing that completely changed the trajectory of my entire life and the reason that I'm here making videos like this at all. Today, we'll be talking about Sailor Moon. Well, my relationship with Sailor Moon, really, hence the title of this video, because it definitely goes a lot deeper than just, ooh, pretty art must replicate. I know Sailor Moon is generally considered one of the quote-unquote starter anime for my generation, especially girls, but it was so foundational for me, I can't not talk about it. Right, so some quick context to start out with. I had already been exposed to comics. This wasn't, like, the medium itself wasn't anything new to me. My mom had always had these like anthology collections of newspaper strip comics, and I have an uncle who is very into Western comics, on top of coming from a generally pretty artistic family to begin with. My grandpa would always save the Sunday funnies for my brother and I, and my abuela would constantly draw on all the cards and letters that she'd send us, and my abuelo would make his own holiday decorations. So I'm overall come from a very creative line of people. So comics as a medium were nothing new to me, but I was more used to like newspaper strip style comics than like actual like comic books and graphic novels. And I'd already tried I tried drawing my own newspaper comic strips based off of the like family dynamic in the anthology books that my mom had. They were terrible, but anyway, so I wasn't new to comics at all at this point, so there. I also wasn't really a stranger to like girls superhero things. I was very into the Powerpuff Girls growing up. Like I remember my friends and I would play Powerpuff Girls with me on the playground during recess. We had a Powerpuff Girl themed birthday for one of us. It was the thing for my little friend group when I was a kid. So, in general, comics and superheroines were nothing new to me at this point in time. I was maybe like 8 or 9 around this point in time. Manga, however, was not something I had ever encountered before this point. I first discovered Sailor Moon purely by chance. My mom had taken my brother and I to a used bookstore in a nearby city, and I came across it sitting on one of the little, like, end caps of a bookshelf. I don't know if that's what they're called, but you know how there's, like, a rack full of books that, like, hangs off the side of a bookshelf? That's what it was sitting on. The bright blue cover and Usagi's long blonde hair stood out like a beacon, and, of course, I was drawn to it. Pun not intended. I can recall so clearly my first reaction being, I didn't know that you could draw things this pretty. Between the more simplified newspaper comics and the gritty, realistic Western comics I'd been exposed to up to now, seeing the light, airy, sparkly, delicate art of Sailor Moon was groundbreaking for me. So we got the book, which happened to be right at the climax of the Deathbusters arc, so I had zero context for what was going on, but I honestly didn't even care about that at this point. And I remember trying to read it using the headlights of the cars behind us as we drove the hour back home that night. That didn't really work, and I ended up feeling carsick because of the winding road. But the point is, I was obsessed with this, and it basically became my Bible for comics for much of my adolescence. I really threw myself into drawing from this point on, trying my best to copy the panels from the manga and figure out how I could, quote unquote, draw pretty also. My obsession led to somebody getting a VHS copy of some of the TV show episodes, miraculously also from the Deathbusters arc, but also from in the middle of it, so I didn't have much context for how, like, the story arc was set up and how it got to the point that I was exposed to. And I would watch those as religiously as I read my one manga volume. I also tried copying the art from the show too. I can still vividly remember drawing Sailor Venus with a giant head that took up half a page of notebook paper, and a teeny tiny body distraught at a pure heart being eaten by a snake monster. I don't know, I don't know what kind of monster I was trying to make, because the monsters in the show were very much humanoid, but that's what I remember. Actually, it might have been because the snake was a lot easier to draw than people, because I was not good at drawing people at this point. Over the years, thanks to parents and relatives and so on, I collected more and more of the manga, VHS tapes of more of the anime and the movies, novelizations of the first few episodes of the anime, little info books about all of the inner soldiers, all kinds of things. You can probably gauge what point in time this was based on the fact that I'm talking about VHS tapes. So this was like very early 2000s. So now that I had expanded the range of just the sheer amount of media from this franchise that I had, I finally got to see how the story began, how the world was fleshed out, and how each separate story arc ended up progressing the way that it did. And I remember going online to try and find scans of the Stars arc, which hadn't been released in the US at that point in time, at least in anime form. I remember I think the first manga volume of the Stars arc, but the anime hadn't made it stateside at all. And it was really hard to find these manga volumes because they were like from an old, like, the imprint that became Tokyo Pop. I think it was called Mix Comics or something. So they were very difficult to find because they were kind of dated at that point. So I had no idea how certain things ended, and it really bothered me. So I turned to the internet like any good little millennial. I also remember being terrified whenever I would see little, like, snippets of panels and stuff from later on in the Stars arc, in part because it's generally pretty dark, I would say, but also it wasn't something that I was able to find in the States. Like, this is, my line of thought was like, oh, this is something that's really terrible. I'm not supposed to see this. So it was like thrilling and kind of scary at the same time. It was a wild time. So as I said before, I was completely obsessed, and this series franchise, I'm just gonna call it a series because this is mostly talking about the manga, But I do also just mean the whole Sailor Moon franchise entirely, aside from like the live action stuff, which as of September 2024, I still have not seen any of. But Sailor Moon as a whole became a cornerstone of what would become my artistic career. Sadly, as of 2024, I no longer have access to my hoard of Sailor Moon goods. I've been rebuilding my collection slowly because money, things are expensive. But I have the reprinted manga, including the Sailor V manga and the 2 volumes of side stories. I have a couple figures, one tiny, tiny little replica wand, a cosplay outfit that no longer fits. Rest in peace, Schoolgirl Usagi. You were so much fun to wear. Maybe one day I can wear you again. And then smaller things like accessories, like hair clips and jewelry, and then assorted just regular merch that I usually get at artist alleys at conventions, like prints and charms and things like that. Okay, now that you know how I got into Sailor Moon, let's get into how it helped shape how I draw. So the large, sparkly, expressive eyes are probably the first thing that people notice. I did choose to pair this video with this speed paint specifically because I think a lot of the Sailor Moon influence comes through compared to some of the other things that I've drawn. And from my perspective, that's most evident in the large, sparkly eyes. Expressions from manga in general really appeal to me. I've always thought that the exaggerated expressions in newspaper comics looked kind of weird or gross, or the more realistic drawings in like Western comic books were difficult for me to read because of things like spot blacks and generally being drawn in a more subtle way. And I also kind of thought it looked kind of gross because of the large amount of black ink. I don't know what 8-year-old me was thinking. Being more heavily stylized, the expressions in manga appealed to me a lot more because to me it was a lot more clear how characters were feeling. This ties into an overall ease of readability. I primarily work in color right now for my comics, but the manga is predominantly white art paired with screen tones of varying density. Delicate line art and selective use of black made it much easier for me to actually tell what was going on. And for a long time, I mostly made black, white, and grayscale comics to the best of my abilities because it was easier for me to read and understand what was happening and also didn't require a lot of art supplies. And to this day, I still tend to dislike art that looks too cluttered or busy because it's hard for me to tell what's happening a lot of the time. And sometimes I come across something that's the opposite, where something is drawn so sparsely that I have a hard time telling what's happening as well. Finding a good balance can be challenging, and that's something that I think I struggle with, especially working in color. I'm not consciously aware of how balanced my art is between light and dark areas since I rely so heavily on color to convey everything right now. That is something that I would like to work on in the future, but I just don't have time right now. I do really want to make more black and white comics so that I can practice all of these things and not rely just on color so much. But that's probably definitely quite a ways off for me. I just have too much on my plate right now to even really think about doing anything in that regard. So I don't want to necessarily say that Sailor Moon's art is simple, because I'm not meaning that in like a derogatory way, but in my opinion, it's definitely very streamlined, and it looks like it was relatively quick and easy to draw all of the characters and everything. As a result, the comic has a lot of same face syndrome. Everyone's proportions are pretty similar, and there isn't a lot of variety in facial features and body types. This is something that I had adopted, like I'm sure many other anime and manga-inspired artists have done as well. And I'm definitely trying to break the habit and draw more diverse features and body types. It is a very slow-going process, but I am working on that. How I draw now is definitely different from when I was imitating Sailor Moon. My lines are a lot heavier, and it's got a more grounded feeling compared to Sailor Moon's airy quality. I think largely because I do work in color, and so my art resembles a lot more what you would see in anime than you would see in a manga at this point. I don't really leave any gaps in the line art like the manga does because with how I color everything, it's annoying when I start coloring and the gap, I just use the fill bucket tool. So if I leave gaps in the line art, the color will just sometimes just bleed out onto the rest of the panel or the page, and it's really, really annoying to fix. I know I could fix that by adjusting my tool settings, but I don't do that because I can't be bothered. So overall, my art just has more of like a solid feeling because it doesn't have those like gaps and it doesn't have that airiness necessarily that the manga does. The original anime also has a very dreamy, airy quality to it because of the watercolor backgrounds that utilize soft but vibrant color palettes, which I don't do in my current comic because the setting and environments are just as important as the characters. And because I'm trying to portray a very specific setting, I'm limiting myself to very specific colors that are very bright and saturated. I also just use a fairly, at least in my opinion, a fairly large brush for all of my inks, and I have a good amount of like line weight variation. So overall, my line work, even just by itself, is a lot heavier visually compared to Sailor Moon. Sailor Moon has very like thin lines for all of its inks, which I think look great, but that's just not how I draw anymore. I do think it works for the story that I'm trying to tell right now with my webcomic. Sailor Moon is very like ethereal and otherworldly, while my comic is very grounded in the real world despite the magical aspects because of its historical setting. There aren't any ancient moon civilizations or deep space palaces in my comic, so I think the heavier inks in my current work suit the setting of being grounded in this is a real place that existed at a real point in time. Also, just a quick aside, manga generally is made by a team of people in order to meet publication deadlines. Webcomics generally are made by one or two people, maybe a small team, and are typically not published whole chapters at a time in print or on a weekly or monthly basis. As a result, I'm able to put a lot more time and effort into a few pages each month, but I'm also only able to put out a few pages each month, which also contributes to the differences in my style and Sailor Moon's style. Sailor Moon had to be made pretty quickly, so everything's a lot more simplified, whereas I can take as much time as I want and put as many details as I want in there, and nobody can tell me not to. There's also, at least things to me that stand out as obvious visual cues from Sailor Moon. Like, I like drawing characters with a lot of like long flowing hair and things like that. But I don't know if people would necessarily pick up on those things as like, hey, this looks just like in Sailor Moon. So, in addition to all of the visual influences, I also take a lot of cues from the writing. Unfortunately, due to the nature of webcomics, it's gonna take quite a while to get to any of the points where people would be able to pick up on things that I was influenced by Sailor Moon when it comes to writing the plot and storyline of my comic. But I've taken a lot of cues from the writing as well. My comic is also primarily focused on women, some who have magical abilities, themed in and around Greek mythology, and centers on a seemingly ordinary girl who ends up eventually saving the world from the big bad evil guy. Granted, tons of other magical girl media follow this basic plotline of ordinary girl defeating bad guy with the power of love and friendship, because Sailor Moon really set the standard for that, and it's become a standard formula for the genre. But a lot of what I'll be putting in my comic that centers around this theme is because of what I read in Sailor Moon. This was my first exposure to the concept, and so that is what has stuck with me all these years. I'm not following the plot structure one to one. If anything, I'm planning to get a bit darker and more in depth than Sailor Moon was able to due to publishing limitations. But again, due to the nature of webcomics, it will likely be several years before any of the writing aspects come to the forefront of my webcomic. So all of these influences really shine through in what I make, and I get compared to Sailor Moon quite a bit. Though I'm sure a good amount of that is just because of how well known Sailor Moon is. Sailor Moon is really the only magical girl series that people tend to be familiar with if it's not usually a genre that they lean towards. I will admit, sometimes it does bother me when people make that comparison, especially lately since I've been trying to lean more into doing my own thing with my art and my storytelling and just my comics in general. But more often than not, it is pretty flattering because it's a series that I personally love so much and have looked up to since I was a kid. So being compared to this incredible series that has shaped my life, that's a huge compliment to me. And it's not just Sailor Moon. All of Naoko Takeuchi's art has the same kind of dreamy quality to it. Over the years, I've branched out beyond Sailor Moon and started reading some of her other works like PQ Angels and Prism Time and Toki Mecha, but nothing has really ticked as many of my boxes as Sailor Moon, though that could also just be because I found Sailor Moon at a very formative age, so it has just embedded itself in my brain. Things like princesses and magic and ancient civilizations and mythology were all things I was already pretty into when I first came across all of it in Sailor Moon. I've always been interested in history in general, so a lot of these things were already within my realm of interests. So, seeing all of it paired together with a group of seemingly ordinary girls that became friends and fought evil together using their alter ego secret identities seemed almost tailor made for me, as someone who was also very ordinary but had trouble making friends and wanted something exciting in her life. I do still try and have that sort of dreamy quality to my art outside of my webcomic. A lot of what I make when I'm doing personal art or like my branding or anything like that is generally very soft, lots of pastels, flowers, sparkles, flowing hair and fabric, all of that. The Saffron Wave is definitely an exception and has a much stronger overall color scheme than what I usually lean towards because of the time period and setting. A lot of what I've seen in Minoan art and architecture utilizes rich reds, yellows, and blues, so that's kind of become my default color palette for the majority of the comic, and I leave all of like the pastels and like the softer purples and things like that for the more magical aspects. If you look at, for example, my other webcomic, Oh Holy Hex, there's a lot more predominant pastels and it has an overall softer look than Saffron Wave does. Which also I just realized is because Sailor Moon isn't my only influence when it comes to making my webcomic, it's just that is where a lot of the foundations for my art style come from. So, needless to say, this series has had a huge impact on me and continues to inspire me to this day. I honestly don't think I would have become the kind of artist that I am today without Sailor Moon. As a whole, this series just means so much to me. I don't think I'll ever be able to get away from the influence that it's had on me as a creator. And I don't mean that in a bad way, in any capacity. There's not really a better way for me to phrase that. Obviously, I draw a lot of inspiration from a lot of other creators and media and just the sources in general, which is why this is a series of videos instead of just one obscenely long video. So, I think I'm gonna end it there. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for listening to me yap semi-coherently about Sailor Moon for 20 odd minutes. You can find my webcomic at saffronwave.spiderforest.com, and I do also still have my Comic Fury site up that is now a mirror and is one update behind the Spider Forest site. So definitely check that out. Let me know what you think. As far as my social media, I am Calorie Bird on pretty much every platform. I primarily use Tumblr and Blue Sky right now, but I have like Instagram and all of that stuff as well. As far as YouTube, I do not have a schedule right now, so I would recommend subscribing and clicking the notification bell so that way you are notified whenever I do post a new video, because my life and my time management skills are just not at the point where I can maintain a consistent schedule for YouTube. I generally upload at least once a month on average, so just getting those notifications would be the best way to keep tabs on my videos. Alright, alternatively, you can also support me on Patreon. I post all of my art and videos and everything like that there before they go live on social media for the most part. So if you want early access to my comic or to my YouTube videos, you can join my Patreon and you can get all those little goodies as well. Speaking of, thank you to my current patrons for giving me their support and allowing me to make content like this. I truly, truly appreciate it, and I'm so glad that you've all stuck with me for so long. I'm going to wrap things up here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will hopefully see you next time. Bye.